Welcome to Amphik Hunter Valley. Today we are looking at the book of Second Corinthians. Second Corinthians. Compared to Second Timothy, these are the only two epistles that are considered to be very personal in terms of intimacy with the audience and concerns and dealing in particular and exposing certain features that are about the basic background, the character, and the experience of the apostle. Let's start by looking at the background of this book. Certain events had taken place actually that had caused Paul to write the first letter to the Corinthians, where he tried to address problems that this church, which he had founded earlier on, was facing some problems. And then we talked earlier on about the effect of having a Gentile composition that was in the majority, how that affected the operation of the church. But now he actually wrote two other letters, and some of those have been lost. And so this would have been the fourth letter that he writes to these particular people. What actually happens is that the first letter was not as effective as the Apostle Paul expected it to be, so he had to write another second one and a third one, but still he needed to write a fourth one, and this is what we are looking at right now. And then we see that there was a lot of suffering and personal anguish that actually resulted from this because there was the opposition at Corinth had actually grown stronger. Although he had been well received by the majority of the church, there were a few obnoxious leaders. We see that in the book of 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 5 to 11, and also in chapter 10 verse 7 to 12. And then there'd also been an introduction of infectious teaching that had actually infiltrated the church at Corinth, and a result of that there was also talk by the opposition that this man is in terms, when you look at him, he's almost insignificant, he's unimpressive, and his speech is a bit dodgy and probably doubtful, and they even use words like fickle to describe him, and they thought there was a certain arrogance about him, and yet their mission was really to undermine his authority and apostleship. So part of this book is actually a letter written to defend his apostleship. When we look at it, it reads almost like maybe the closest to a curriculum vitae in terms of the content, or what some people would call a resume, because it says a lot about Paul's personal history, and then also it actually gives the detailed experience as a minister that he had, where he went to, why he went there, and how this validates him as an apostle. Then there's also the revelation of the apostle Paul himself in terms of character and how he had become who he had become. Then we say that in the writing of this letter, he actually underwent a lot of hard, difficult, physical suffering while he was writing this. We see this in chapter 1, verse 8 to 10. Then we also see that although he had this pain, it was overridden by his compassion for the saints and the love for them, that they needed his help, they needed to do this. He was doing his duty, and it showed his commitment. We also see that later on he carries out a brief visit, which was rather unpleasant for himself as well as the church. This is described in chapter 2 verse 1 and also in chapter 13 verse 2. Then he then writes a severe letter which is delivered by Titus, and this is talked about and referred to in chapter 2 verse 4 and also in chapter 7 verse 6 to 8. Then he then writes this particular epistle after all these events have taken place. That's when he writes this particular epistle from Macedonia when he was on his way to Corinth. And then in writing this, we find that it is also around this time that he writes the book of Romans. That was on his last visits to Corinth, and we see that in chapter 20 of the book of Acts. A lot of chapters there, but not a big deal if you go over them a few times. They will become second nature to you. Then if you wanted to look at maybe the message of this particular episode, we see a sense of trying to comfort that we see in chapter 1, chapter 4, chapter 2, chapter 4, chapter 7, and chapter 13. Then he also writes about his ministry, and then Compared to his other writings, this is probably the least systematic. You know, Paul was a very disciplined and thorough and diligent scholar, but this is the least systematic. Maybe because it's also one of the emotional ones. He was really engaged and he suffered a lot for a church that he had come. It was like his little child. He was having problems, and then he was trying to solve them, and then he was meeting opposition by people who even quite wanted to take away, you know, his credibility as an apostle. But what is good about it all is that, you know, God finally vindicates him, and he proves that Paul was indeed an excellent. And I mean, even today, you can't talk about the doctrine of Jesus Christ based on the New Testament without relying heavily on Paul. So Paul's defense of his conduct and his ministry are seen from this first section, if we were to divide it into three parts, from chapter 1 to chapter 7, verse 16. Then later on, he also deals with offering of collecting of the offering for the poor saints in Judea who needed help. We see that in chapter 8, verse 1, and also in chapter 9, verse 15. What is interesting, especially when you are in full-time ministry, is how important it is to be able to handle finance and to also speak finance and also to be blessed and also to be a giver. And because we can teach above what we actually live, but we can only reproduce what we live. In other words, you produce who you are. Then finally, the third section sees us seeing, you know, the vindication of the apostle Paul. What a blessing this book is. It's not very long, 13 chapters, but because we have dealt in some detail about certain common factors in terms of background and the setting in which this book is written. I mean, we talked about Corinth, about Julius Caesar, about the Straits of Gibraltar. If you watched the 45th video of us that we produced in Bible Synthesis 3. So in short, this particular book, if we were to take a bird's eye view, that it's got about 13 chapters, and also it is actually the fourth of the epistles that Paul writes to the church at Corinth. And then when you look at it chronologically from Romans, 1 Corinthians, this is actually the third epistle written by Paul. And it is typically an epistle that is written to a church, not to an individual. And the purpose was for Paul to affirm his ministry and also to defend his authority as an apostle. What this means is that all of us may be called, but sometimes there will come a test when you have to defend and prove yourself that to be. And it is good and great that God always vindicates his people. We also must look at the tone in which this is actually written. Some of the words here are very strong, but he needed to correct and teach in the face of opposition, so he stood up. And what is unfortunate is that in terms of appearance, you are somebody people would probably overlook. Some people got to the extent of even saying, when he writes so powerfully, but when he's there. And then some people also questioned his ability to communicate. I don't know if the fact that this either young man who fell asleep in the window and died was an indication of maybe how monotonous or boring that Apostle Paul's preaching could have been. But he is such a skilled writer and effective in ministry, a student indeed. If you look at his command of an understanding of the Judaic culture and the rabbinic teaching, he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. What is interesting is that sometimes you don't need to be derailed by a lot of people, because this letter was actually received quite well by the majority of the church, but unfortunately there were few stubborn people who really wanted to be the official opposition and derailed him, maybe for their own expense and for their own interest, and to promote their interest and popularity, whatever their motives were. People even questioned his motives. For somebody who had gone through so much, it was hard for him to come from being, somebody who persecuted Christians, then he comes to Christ, for him to be accepted, and how he had got, God had raised people like Barnabas to stand with him and all that. So he writes this book from Macedonia in about 55 to 57 AD. And the key people in this particular book, unlike the first one, which we had Paul, Timothy, and then close household. Here we now have Paul and Timothy, but close household is replaced by Titus. Then, like I said earlier on, together with 2 Timothy, these two books are probably the most personal of Paul's writings. The other thing we can also talk about maybe in terms of content, sometimes it helps just to go over information and present it in a slightly different manner. We could say that Paul explains his actions in chapter 1 and 2, and then in chapter 2 verse 12 to 7, verse 16, he defends and he illustrates what would be the components of genuine ministry. People are going to doubt your ministry, and until you've been tested, maybe people shouldn't trust you, because it's good to see that the true character of a man or a woman comes out when they are under pressure, and you will be tested, and people will falsely accuse you, not because they are evil, but sometimes it's just a season and the proper purpose in which God prepares us. That's why our father wrote a book which says people do not change unless they experience pressure, and usually pressure shows us what is on the inside. Then in chapter 8 and 9, he defends and supports the collection. I think as a leader, I can't emphasize this too much. It's the second time that I'm probably speaking about this in this video, but we need to be able to minister. In other words, we should be givers, and at the same time we should be able to encourage people to give, because ministry is finance and it costs money to go into the world and preach the gospel. But in his writing, we can identify what we can call some key result areas. First of all is church discipline. The church needs to be disciplined. Sometimes we end up trying to compromise by being nice and popular, and then we compromise discipline, whereas the Bible encourages us to rebuke the wrongdoing publicly, so that people may be ashamed. And we read in the book of Acts, people wouldn't dare join the church because they could see the seriousness and the discipline, the commitment and the power and the movement of God. But above all, he speaks about the hope of a risen Christ Jesus. Yes, taking away the condemnation that we had, and so that there's now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus, and that he was the testator of the new covenant, who took our place, the substitutionary lamb that took away the sins of the world. And that justification and faith is by faith in Jesus Christ. That's the hope that we have, and his resurrection, that he went about for 40 days. Yes, parading himself and showing the inner circle, a closed circuit, so to speak, that he had risen and overcome the arch enemy, which is death. Then the other section that is dealt with here, the key result area, is giving. Giving is very important. It is more blessed to give than to receive. Then, of course, sound doctrine. Remember, like I said earlier on in the first video, that he was talking to people who didn't have a Mosaic background. They didn't have Judaism. They didn't understand covenant. They didn't have the basic law. They hadn't been integrated into the church through the process of living Egypt in the desert and seeing the miracles of God. These are people who were largely Gentile, and some of the things they wanted to do was basically based on common sense instead of the law and the ways of God. They didn't understand them thoroughly, and then just a few days down the line, they become challenged. And this is what happens in this particular book. I never live without, first of all, yes, encouraging, if you do not know Jesus Christ, that you need to be saved, because it is the only way to salvation, because there is no other name given among men whereby we must be saved. I also want to encourage you to use these resources, the Africa Multination for Christ College notes that you find, that we can supply you, and then also GW Knight's 2003 Bible Handbook, and also J.W. Porter's Illustrated Guide to the Bible. I also love the Tyndale Students Bible Handbook, one of my favorites, and also David Smith's Brief Survey of the Bible. The other one is B.W. Johnson. It's an older version. It's called the People's New Testament. Very powerful and very informative. I will close in prayer now. Father, I want to thank you for the study of the book of 2nd Corinthians. We glorify your name, Lord, as we thank you for an opportunity to learn. You are glorious, you are holy, you are worthy. Yes, high and lifted up. We love you and we worship you, God. In Jesus Christ's name I pray. This is the end of our segment today. Rather short, because we've done the background already of 1st Corinthians. See you next time. We go out as usual with this beautiful song by Mercy Me, one of my favorite songs. I love it. Let's wait for it. Powerful.
I can count